Il y a une place là.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name's Grant. I'm a bookseller here where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones as to not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, we have a mic set up by this right pillar. Please line up and speak clearly into the mic so everyone can hear the question. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Debra Bruno, promoting her new book, A Hudson Valley Reckoning. A Hudson Valley Reckoning recounts Bruno's journey into the nearly forgotten history of Northern slavery and of the thousands of enslaved people brought in chains to Manhattan and the Hudson Valley. Debra Bruno is a journalist whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic, among many other publications. She lives in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit her website, debrabruno.com. Bruno will be in conversation with Helene Cooper. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Cooper covers national security for the New York Times and is the author of The House at Sugar Beach, which was a New York Times bestseller, as well as Madam President, a Washington Post bestseller. The librarian-born writer previously worked at the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming Debra Bruno and Helene Cooper.
Oops. I already did. I'm already like. Oh. Hello. Look, there's deer. I'm not gonna do that when each of your children that I see. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here tonight, and I'm really excited to be here with my very good friend Debbie. So welcome. Debbie, congratulations on this amazing book. I think I told you earlier I was so proud of you. So do you want to say anything?
No, thank you. I'm looking around and I'm seeing everybody. I think everyone I know in Washington and Northern Virginia. And, when you live in a place since 1986, you really do have a lot of good friends here. So it's really wonderful to see everyone. Do you want to get started?
Yeah, let's start. So I feel like I already know about the Pasquale Bruno part of your family, because in my mind you've always been Italian. You certainly never cooked no Dutch food for me, and I thank you for that. But not so much about the Van Valkenburgs and the Dutch part of your family. Have you always presented yourself sort of as both Dutch and Italian, or?
No, I mean, the Italian is the fun part, right? I mean, this is the ravioli at Christmas and, going to church and, just the red sauce part of my heritage. And so I didn't know not much about my Dutch heritage, except that we were Dutch and we had been in the country for a long time. So I thought that's kind of boring. We were farmers. We had lived in the United States before it was a country, since the 1600s. So I honestly didn't think much more than that's interesting. That's an old family, but I didn't know anything else.
So tell us then about the happenstance that sort of leads you to writing this. What happened? Were you already looking into doing something with your history? Had you done 23andMe? Had you done ancestry.com? And you end up somehow in a conversation with a historian who says, look it. So can you walk us a little bit through that?
Yes, I had been talking about my Dutch family, and actually it was a historian who used to live in D.C., Mire K. Ricks, who said to me, "Oh, I've done research on this. If you have ancestors in the Hudson Valley, they were Dutch. They were probably enslavers." And I said, "No, not my family. They were poor. They were farmers."
Wait. Back up a second.
So,
you can't just jump to that like that.
Okay.
Put us in the moment.
Okay.
Were you guys
all right.
were you guys at dinner together? Were you at a cocktail party and you just happened to start talking about nobody just happens to start talking about their ancestors?
I think I was interested in ancestors, but I don't honestly, that's a really good question. I think that I just got interested in learning about an old family, not thinking that it really was anything, because the interesting thing about the Van Valkenburgers in particular was that they stayed right in that spot in the Hudson Valley for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they didn't move, they didn't travel west. Many of them didn't. They didn't. They didn't make much more of themselves than, say, for example, the Roosevelts, which did. And so I thought, what could I possibly know about them? They were just farmers. And I knew my grandparents were farmers, my great grandparents were farmers, their parents were farmers, all up in the Catskill Mountains and the Hudson Valley. And I thought, what else could you possibly learn about that? So I honestly didn't know, but I did care about ancestry. I did find one, when I started looking into ancestry, I did find one ancestor who was a witch in 1690s Stamford, Connecticut, who was tried as a witch.
Sequel?
Yeah, that's my next book. And I thought that was kind of an interesting and quirky story, but again, just one-offs. So when I learned about this other part, and I managed to delay it for a few years by moving to China. I didn't move to China to avoid it, but life got in the way. We were living in China for 3 years, and so I managed to put off delving into ancestry for quite a while.
What was your reaction to Mary Kay Ricks telling you, your ancestors were probably slaveholders? Did you believe her?
Total denial. I said it's not possible, because I was imagining the large plantations of the South, not the small places in the Hudson Valley, the small farms. I thought of slavery as large Southern, things we fought the Civil War over kinds of things. I didn't realize how pervasive it was in the North as well, not just New York State, but very much New York State.
So what sent you, if you didn't believe Mary Kay, then what sent you looking? And can you walk us through?
She was
sort
so
of the
certain.
discovery?
She said, just look. So I looked, and I got on Ancestry, and it took me about 5 minutes to find the will of my 5 times great-grandfather, Isaac Collier. And in his will, he's bequeathing his enslaved people to his children and grandchildren. And he named some, and then he said, and the rest of them share and share alike. And I thought, wow, that is the most dehumanizing statement I could possibly imagine. And it really hit me with sort of a gut punch, because I thought, well, that's evidence right there in handwriting that I have an ancestor. Isaac Collier was interesting to me because my grandmother's maiden name was Collier. So that was a direct line. And it was in the very town that I grew up. So this wasn't just a remote ancestor. This was my family name and right where I grew up.
Where did you find this will?
On Ancestry.com. Shout out to Ancestry.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. There's a lot of digitizing, and I think that's the other interesting thing, is that maybe 20 years ago, people wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to kind of find these kinds of things without spending many hours in archives and libraries, or going to Salt Lake City, which has an incredible archive of deceased family records. But I think that because everything now is so much more accessible, you can find these records, that it's easy to kind of get at that material without going anywhere.
So you described this moment in the book, sort of, I think you didn't say fuck, but you might be, you said
I
shit.
said shit.
You said shit. And it's like, it's really, pardon my language, pardon Debbie's language, but it actually, I thought it puts you in that moment where you actually realize. I remember when I was working on my book, realizing that my ancestors, who I had thought were heroes, were in many ways, we're all human. They're very grounded and they had huge numbers of faults.
Yeah.
How did you feel?
Well, first of all, I felt horrible, because I felt that I really had, what I had not denied, but what I had kind of tucked away in the back of my head for a long time was reality, and it was right in my face. But my second, almost instantaneous reaction was, because I'm a journalist, okay, now I have to write something, because I have to tell this story. So I'm always quick to try to pivot to something else where I can say, okay, now I need to have other people learn this too. So I immediately tried to sell that story. And I was immediately asked by an editor at the Washington Post, who asked a very important question: can you find people who are descended from the enslaved in that same town. And I thought, right, good luck. This was in the 1700s, 1800s, and into the 19th century. But it was, as you know, almost impossible to find many of those records. But I found a Facebook group that has a kind of a crazy name, but it really was useful, called I've Traced My Enslaved Ancestors and Their Owners. I joined this group. I put out a call for information on New York State. I didn't say anything more particular than that. And within 24 hours, I had a note from a woman named Eleanor Mire who said, I come from enslaved people in Coxsackie and New Baltimore, which was exactly the small town where I grew up. So I thought, well, that's pretty amazing that I was able to connect right away with that person, which felt in a kind of a spiritual way like maybe this was meant to be. Maybe we were meant to connect. So that was also good, because then that led me on a journey of learning about her family and finding out about her family and the matriarch of her family, who is on the cover of my book, who's a woman named Mire Vandery, who to me is a symbol of resilience and just fortitude, and who had a large family and whose descendants are still connected today and connected with me. I found a number of them. So that was really fantastic to be able to tell their story as well as my family. And then we realized that not only did my family enslave her family, but that it's likely that we have a genetic connection, because Mary Vandery's first 4 children were probably the result of being raped by a member of my family. So that made it an all-American story in lots of ways, too.
I want to come back to Mary Vandery, but first let's go back a little bit to Eleanor. You were on this Facebook page, and she posted that, or responded to your post.
Yeah.
Tell me what happened. Did you pick up the phone and call her? What happened?
Well, we exchanged some emails, and I said, can we talk on the phone? So we talked on the phone, and what was really good about that was the fact that we were very similar in lots of ways. We had a similar sort of attitude toward, let's just do the research. Let's not do a lot of hand-wringing over what this history was. Let's find out what we can find. And we traded stories. And she was very lucky because she had the wife of a cousin who had dug into the family history. She had an entire big, thick file folder of stories about her family. So she shared all of that with me. And then we started putting the pieces together. But
was she looking for the white part of her family?
No, she was
What
looking
was she
for her
looking
family.
for?
She was looking for her family history. She was looking to learn about her ancestry. She was looking for what she could find. It wasn't necessarily what it was. What was interesting is that her grandmother, who must have known Mary Vandery, because her grandmother was long-lived and Mary Vandery was long-lived, her grandmother told her that their family in New York State had never been enslaved. So there was a certain amount of denial on her family's part as well. And she thought that couldn't be true. She was questioning that, but she was never able to, her grandmother passed before she could actually go back to her grandmother and say, look what I found. But she was also on a journey. She was looking as well.
One of the things that I kept thinking as I was going through your book is just this, and I'm sure you talked to her about it, and I'd love to hear what she said, is when I look back, because I have the exact same, not the exact same, because my people were from the South, from Virginia and South Carolina, but I have a lot, I want to know about the Black part of my family, the people who were slaves. I have a lot of ambivalence about the white part, the slave owners who raped or had sex with, my ancestors and resulted in me. Did you guys talk about this? Did she want to find out more about your side of the family? Was there any ambivalence? Was there anger? How did the two of you work through this?
That's a good question. I don't think she was angry, because I think she's not a person who wants to point fingers and cast blame, but I think she was obviously more interested in the Black part of her family.
Yeah.
But I think it was much more not whether it was white or Black, but it was much more the question of who were they? Who were they? Who was Thomas Vandery, who was the oldest son of Mary Vandery, and from whom all the Vanderys I've found today have descended? Who was he? He was a boatman on the Hudson. We can find articles about him. Yes, he probably had a white father, but we don't know that for sure. We don't know who that father was. So yes, I think one of the things that we both were thinking is not to discover who was white and who was black, but to discover what those stories were and to just tell those stories because they weren't told before.
So, okay, tell me about your relationship with Eleanor.
We're friends. We have a very similar, very dry sense of humor. We trade a lot of jokes about things that have nothing to do with slavery or, the research we've been doing. She's a Yankee fan, which helps a lot, especially since she lives in
You
Boston.
know, your husband sent me a Yankees hat like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
I didn't wear it. But thank you for the hat. Bob.
She's a Yankees fan in Boston, so she's a brave woman, and she's also, and it's also so that was something we talked about. Her son her son and I have a good relation. We love each other. He's a really sweet guy. So, we have other things we talk about. We hang out. We go to the beach. We went up.
Are you guys friends now?
Yes, we're
Do you feel
friends.
like-
Yes. She's a good friend. Yeah, yeah. I don't think everyone who is descended from people my family enslaved necessarily wants to be my buddy, and I understand that too. I don't think you necessarily have to have that kumbaya moment where everyone is holding hands and it's all wonderful. But I do think that because we had a very similar goal in mind, which was to tell the family story and to tell the family history and to make sure that their stories were out there, that we both got that. We both cared about that part.
Okay, I'm jumping. You've mentioned Mary Vandery several times now, so I wanted to save her for the end, but let's jump to her now. Tell us about Mary Vandery.
So Mary Vandery was born in the twilight period, what I call the twilight period of New York State slavery. So she was born in 1802. So she was born not enslaved, but she was born to enslaved parents. But because she was born in that period, she was owed a period of servitude.
She's Black.
She was a Black woman. Her father, and this is where it gets really complicated, her father is listed in some census records as mulatto. So we don't know really, but the picture of her, she's, when I saw that photo of her taken on her 100th birthday, I thought, this is a person I need to know about. So she lived in the family of Conrad Hotelling, and the Hotellings are in my family tree. While she was in her teens, when she was 13, she had her first child. She was not married. She had her first child. And she had 4 children. We can track 3 of those children. So maybe one baby died. We don't know. She lived in that
4 children by the time she was 18, right?
before she turned 20. Yeah. She was before she was 19. Yeah. So she was a child herself when she had these babies. And she then had a period of not having children, which Eleanor figured out. We put it together that right then was when her father had purchased his own freedom. So her father, we think, may have purchased his freedom to get his daughter to live with him so she could be more protected. She didn't then have another baby until she was married about 5 years after that. So it seems a little too coincidental that these things happened in that way.
So what was happening?
So we think that, she was being abused by someone in the household, and her father, by purchasing his own freedom, was able to protect his daughter.
Yeah.
And it may have been the motivation for him, too.
So she was probably being raped in the house that she was growing up in.
Yes.
Were these kids mulatto or what, mixed race? What were these kids? Was
The
she being raped by the white guy
oral
in the house, or-
history is that the kids were fair, but we don't have any pictures of the children. So again, it's a complicated family story. We don't know. So.
And this was happening in New York.
Yes, in the Hudson Valley of New York. So, and this is the thing that I think was most surprising to me is that we think of the North as the good guys in the Civil War. We were the abolitionists. We were the Underground Railroad. We fought on the right side. And the North has done a very good job of whitewashing the earlier history of 200 years of slavery. And we have to basically kind of retell the story so that we can show just how complicated that story is. Yeah. We'll have questions in 1 second.
We will have
Sorry.
questions. We'll open up to questions. We will open up to questions later.
Yeah, I can. I mean, the Hudson, well, my ancestors were all through the Hudson Valley, but we're talking about Greene County, which is about 30 miles south of Albany. So very rural Hudson Valley. Okay. Yeah. But it's not just that area. It was the entire Hudson Valley was full of enslavers.
Now I've lost
So we were
my train of track. One of the things we were talking about backstage earlier is just the whole idea of not expecting this, not the surprise when Mary
Right.
Kay Ricks said that,
Right.
the going back and looking into
Right.
this. What tell me about that. What is it about? You grew up thinking that there wasn't slavery in the North?
Honestly, I grew up thinking that no, I didn't think about it. I thought slavery was in the South. It wasn't on my, I'm 67 years old. It wasn't on my mind, in my mind.
You look fabulous, by the way.
Actually, I'm 87.
You do.
So.
Look at this.
Thank you. But honestly, our curriculum was not really about slavery. We did some very basic history. And I loved history. I loved learning about the Hudson River School painters in the Hudson Valley. I loved learning about Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle and all of those stories. But I honestly didn't know that this was actually even happening. If I saw references to Black people, I thought they were free Black people. But I didn't really think much about it. It's hard to know that something is hidden if you didn't know it was there in the first place. You're looking for something you don't even know is there. So that was the hard part about that, is that I think if I had been born 20 years after that, I probably would have been a little bit more cognizant of what might have been for colonial history,
And do you still have a lot of family from the Dutch side of your family who you talk to about this?
Yes.
What kind of reaction did you get from them?
Everybody's been wonderful and supportive. You have to remember that this is also because I'm such a small town person.
Uh-huh.
The fact of someone from a small town writing a book in itself is like, oh, look, she wrote a book. And the fact that the book is about a fairly dark subject in our history seems secondary to the fact that I wrote a book. So next week, I'm going up to the Hudson Valley to talk in a number of different places. And I think it'll be really interesting because there are some very red pockets of the Hudson Valley. And it'll be very, very interesting to see if I get questions from people about, why are you doing this? This is history. Why are you bringing this up? Do you feel guilty? Those kinds of questions.
Well, on that topic, then, what do you think about this whole idea, which you probe quite well, that the North was sort of an innocent bystander in the whole slave trade and in the slavery movement, and just sort of showed up when abolitionists arrived?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were as complicit. I mean, New York got a lot of benefit from the slave trade. New York City got a lot of benefit from the slave trade. There was so much secondary benefit from from enslavement that it wasn't even worthy of mention. And there was also a whole tradition of assuming that, yes, okay, we had slavery, but it was benign and it was short. And it was neither benign nor short. It may have been a smaller scale than the slavery in the South, but that didn't mean it was any less horrible. So I think that because we could now focus on, look at all the Union soldiers who gave their lives in the Civil War. Look at these sites of the Underground Railroad. New York State is now trying to create a Harriet Tubman byway of the Underground Railroad through New York State, which is great, except that it's skipping over some other parts of history, which I think need to be acknowledged as well.
That's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how hard it was for you to dig some of this up?
I mean, there was one point at which I was sitting in the back of the archives of Vedder Research Library in Coxsackie, New York, just paging through letters that were written during the American Revolution, just page after page after page, just skimming. And, I was skimming for references to enslaved people, to certain words that they would use. But I was also feeling as if I was looking for a needle in a haystack without not knowing exactly what the needle would look like. So, for example, one time I found a letter where someone was writing a very chatty letter. My wife is fine. I hope your wife is fine. Oh, by the way, our slave is dying and he wants his mother to know. And how is it the rest of your family? So it's just stuck in there in this strange and matter-of-fact way that I just happened to find referenced in a letter that was just not, it was almost not an acknowledgement. And I think that was the hard part about all this research. It was there in plain sight, but not acknowledged. So you really had to dig to find it, which was also fascinating and fun.
That is.
And Eleanor and I, we would sit, sometimes we would go back there together. And we'd sit there and go, "Ooh, look, we found one. You know, we'd kind of be giving each other high fives back in the archives, because it was digging, and it was kind of good and horrible at the same time."
That is so interesting. I have this image of the two of you like on this mission. Can you talk a little bit then about how you actually researched this?
Well, besides the online stuff, I did a lot of research at New York State Library in Albany, which has a lot of non-digitized records that were great to find. And I did a lot of research at this Greene County Library in New York, which also had just pages and pages and pages and pages, hundreds of pages of non-digitized letters and bills of sale and wills and all kinds of things like that. So some of it is now being digitized, but a lot of it is just the footwork of doing it and trying to piece together names. And one of the advantages of being from a very rural area is that there are only about 20 family names that you really want to mark. It's a very small and interbred kind of community. So if you find the name Bronk, or you find the name Vandenberg, or you find the name Van Bergen, you're going to find overlaps in all kinds of family things. And then putting those pieces together is really fascinating too.
What would you say to Americans who say this has nothing to do with them?
I've had some questions where people have said to me, "Well, that's not my family. My family's new to this country. We've only been here since the..."
Your Italian part of your family.
Right, the Italian. My grandfather came over, through Ellis Island in the early part of the 20th century. And I would say, white people benefited from all of the results of this history of disenfranchisement. So there's that. And it's also our American history. And if we don't understand our American history and how complicit so many people are in this whole benefit that we get, then we're not really fully understanding American history. So I think that it can be a very distancing move to say, not my family, therefore I don't have to think about it. But that's really kind of a narrow way of looking at it, I think.
Are they starting to teach this in schools in New York now?
To some extent, I think. Yeah, I think the museums are doing a great job of having it, and then the children get brought to the museums and they're told about it. But I don't know as much about what the curriculum is doing currently. I think there's some effort, but I don't really know exactly what's being taught.
You started talking about that you think all white Americans have benefited for this. That opens up the whole issue of reparations. Where do you stand on that?
I think there should be reparations.
Whoa.
I don't know what form those reparations should take, and it's not up to me to decide, what kind of reparations we should have. But, reparations really means repair, and there are lots of ways of repair. You can repair by telling the story more fully. You can repair by having museums acknowledge that enslaved people lived here in this place where they hadn't even existed on paper before. I think there are efforts to create some sort of sense of what kind of financial reparations could be. That's way above my pay grade. I don't know. And I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for a white person to be making decisions about what kind of reparations there should be, but I do think there should be some form of reparations, absolutely.
Has the work you've done on this book changed the way you view your ancestors?
I think that my husband Bob would probably say that now whenever we travel, we go around and I look at an old house and I say, "Oh, slaves probably lived there," So, I think that, yes, I think, this is a complex country and we live in very complicated times right now. But yes, it makes me realize just how much we don't know. I hear a little bit more and more now about the indigenous people of this country and how much they've lost. And I realize just how much a gap of knowledge we have about things like that. So it makes me realize that there are so many stories out there. There are so many historic stories out there that are just full of giant gaps that need to be filled. So there's so much opportunity to tell larger and bigger stories. So this is just a small slice.
But it's such a fascinating slice, and the idea that this is something that wasn't taught in our schools, I think, can't be said enough, because it's such an interesting piece of history that you've managed to unearth. Um, I should have asked you this at the beginning, but why did you feel like you had to write this book?
I felt as if I felt as if the story hadn't been fully told. There more and more now. There are some very good scholarly books out there about slavery in New York. Fantastic research, deep dives into slavery. I think that most people read memoirs and they read more narrative histories. And so I think that one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to reach a larger audience. I wanted more people to read this. I wanted people to care about what they didn't know. I think, there are many people who tell me, "Oh, I'm a history buff. I like this stuff." So here's a story you can tell more fully. So I felt as if, I felt I had a sense of responsibility to tell this story because my family was involved in this. And without having my family involved, it would have been a good story to tell. And there are some fantastic books out there that tell that story of families, interwoven families, without the author having a personal involvement. Mm-hmm. But for me, that intersection almost felt like this was a calling. I had to tell that story.
And how do you feel personally about it? Do you feel guilty?
No,
I
don't feel guilty.
Do you take on that collective guilt?
No, I don't feel guilty. I feel responsible. That I should I tell this story? I can't feel guilty for something my ancestors did. I can't feel guilty for something my father did. I can feel responsible to tell the story, but I think that that's different than feeling guilty. I don't feel bad about who I am. I do feel as if I've been given the opportunity to write this, then that's my role. That's my responsibility.
We're going to open this up to questions. I have one last question for Debbie, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys. If there's one thing that you want to, you've spent how many years working on this book?
At least 5.
5 years of your life. If there's one thing you wanted to sort of say this book is about, what is it?
This book is about a history that hasn't been told in a full way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a microphone right up. I think is there one or two?
There's one here.
There's one over there.
It's hidden behind the pole.
So come on up to the mic, and we can start with you.
Okay. Hi, my name's Catherine. This is great. I'm from the state of Northern Denial. Actually, I'm a Midwesterner, which means my ancestors came from Virginia and Maryland. And some 30 years ago, sitting in a little library outside of Louisville, an old Carnegie Library, digging through memoirs and handwritten pieces, I realized that my family had owned slaves. And if you know anything about American history, Kentucky, wasn't really shocking, but I came from a family of 6 generations of Methodist ministers. And I was taught as a child that we Methodists were anti-slavery.
The good guys.
Yeah. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
So I share your chagrin and your passion for this. My husband thinks I'm nuts, but he's an Italian American. He doesn't share that. My question is, as in your research, what was the most remarkable thing you discovered that you haven't discussed yet? The thing that pierced your heart?
Probably the most remarkable moment was when I had read about an overmantel, which is in a museum in Cooperstown, New York, the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, and it's called the Van Bergen overmantel. And it's remarkable because it's considered the earliest depiction of slavery in New York State, painted in about 1730, a very primitive painting. And I never really thought about the name Van Bergen, and then I realized I had Van Bergen family members. but Eleanor's ancestor, Mary Vandery, her first husband was a man named John Van Bergen. So when I realized that the enslaved people who were pictured on the Van Bergen overmantel could very likely be the ancestors of Eleanor as well, that moment really struck me, because all of a sudden this picture of what looked like little cutout dolls in a painting were people who we could name, and they were names of people who were enslaved, which was fantastic.
Real people, not
Real
imagined
people.
figures.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Hello. So I imagine that there are still people who want to be in denial in this country, but I see very many hopeful signs in our area of new awareness towards the situation of the enslaved people. I'm thinking in particular about places like the Tudor House in Georgetown that I visited recently, and they have changed their narrative about the history of the place. Same thing happened when I visited the Capitol recently. For about 2 years, they have also completely changed the narrative. And I think at Mount Vernon, it's the same thing is happening. So I think what you are doing is contributing to a change, a very important change in the awareness of people.
Thank you.
Let me add a question to that, because that's so interesting what you just said. Because the argument against that is that it's too woke.
Right. It is.
Thoughts?
I hate that word. I hate woke, anti-woke. I hate this terminology which puts labels on things. I hate critical race theory terminology, things like that. It's just a smokescreen for actually talking about real stuff, I think. But I think that not acknowledging something that happens in our history is just, it's nonsense. How can you not acknowledge these things happened, and how can you not teach that in school? I don't think it changes because you don't, the history isn't going to change because you haven't taught it. So I kind of don't know what else to say about that, except that's just not realistic.
Hi, I have that good old 1950s name too, Debbie. And I'm from upstate New York. I live not far from Finger Lakes, from Harry Tubman's National Historic Home. And I did a civil rights, when you're retired, you have time to travel the country and do things you always thought you would do. So I did a lot of the South this winter and went to many of the fabulous museums. And I was in the Lynching Museum in Alabama, and that's not the official title of it, but that was its focus. And there was a whole exhibit on Sundowner, cities and states. And I'm New Yorker. I thought, well, surely I won't find my hometown there. And sure enough, it was there. And then I kept pressing more buttons for all the towns around me. And this is still in the 60s and 70s, Sundowner laws. And it shocked me. Like, I felt very ignorant. I grew up then. How could that be? I never heard that. I didn't know it. We didn't speak of it. So I'd say that just to say your book is so important for that reason. We all have a lot of ignorance that we don't even realize that we own. And your story needs to be told, as do so many others. So thank you.
Thank you. There were lynchings in New York State very, very late. The KKK was very active in New York State very late. So these things I learned about as I was doing the research. There's a lot that's not told.
And it was only recently, 2020-something, that lynchings were against the law in one of the southern states. I don't remember which one, which appalled me. Like, whoa. Yeah. We thought that was the 40s and the 30s, right? So thank you for your book.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth McCain, and I can't wait to read your book. And I have a brief story about how I found out about your book and why I'm here today. And it's a story of synchronicity and connection. I have lived in the Washington, D.C. area for 37 years, but I was born and reared in Mississippi and Tennessee. And 6 months ago, I moved to Asheville, North Carolina. So I came back and went through a divorce hell, and I thought I had said goodbye to D.C., but I had to come back to heal. And it's been really hard. And today I went to get a pedicure in Silver Spring, thinking this will make me feel better. I'm going back to Asheville Tuesday. And, everybody's in their phones and not talking. I'm like, shit, I miss the South. I mean, the South's got problems. People connect in the South, y'all.
Small town, upstate
I'm
New
like,
York.
Silver Spring, right, or small town anywhere, right? So I'm in there, I'm like, okay, Elizabeth, put your phone down and just be present. And this amazing woman caught my eye, who is the director of the chorale that you sang with.
Heather.
Caroline, right?
Oh. Hi, Caroline.
And we caught each other's eyes. Gosh, I hear my southern drawl coming out. I've been in North Carolina now. This is how I really talk. I'm not going to do the code switching that I did when I lived here for so long, trying to talk like this. I really do talk like this, and it's okay. So this lovely, thank you, this lovely woman who looks like she could be my wonderful auntie from the South, we caught each other's eyes from across and she said, hey, I think I know you. And when you have those moments, oh, you look so familiar, but we kept asking questions. Did you go here? Well, finally we got to like the Episcopal Church and psychotherapy and something else, National Cathedral, and I'm not Episcopalian anymore, but it's like a country club, once you're in it, you run into people all the time. I'm like into goddess stuff. Anyway, so she's talking to me, and I'm like, I couldn't hear her because everybody starts to chatter, getting their nails done. So I went over to talk to her closer, and we just started talking about all this stuff. And I said, where are you from? Because she sounds like me, and except mine's more pronounced. So we're chatting, and, trashing the Episcopal Church and talking about singing. And she tells me she's a singer, and I'm a singer. I've got a one-woman show, and I wrote a memoir at the beginning of the pandemic. Anyway, I said, what are you doing after you get your nails done? And she said, I'm going to Politics and Prose to a book signing, a book reading. I said, I love Politics and Prose. And I didn't have any plans for tonight. I'm depressed out the wazoo. And she's just so delightful. And so she tells me about I said, what's the book about? So she tells me. So I came in, and then when you said the power of telling your story, of writing a book or telling your story from a small town, it is so amazing to do that. So I went back this summer for some other stuff, not really for a book. And I went to the local library, and my book's about being a lesbian. It's called Lesbian Belle Tells, and I've been out for 30 years, and nobody ever believes me that, that lesbians everywhere. I'm like, what? Anyway, I'm rambling. So I go in there. And the librarian looks at me and she goes, who are you and what are you doing here? And I said, my name's Elizabeth McCain and I grew up here in Okolona, Mississippi near Tupelo. And she said, oh my God, did you write that scandalous book? And I said, you've read my book? Oh, honey, she said, I featured you as a Mississippi writer and you were the talk of the town and everybody was so upset. But she said, I loved it. I nearly fell off the couch laughing. So my point is the power of storytelling, the power of connecting and getting off our damn phones and looking each other in the eyes and taking a chance to talk to a total stranger. And we had a nice visit before, I'm sure she's a new friend, and your book sounds fabulous. And I want to thank you for making the point that bad stuff happened in the North too, right? And we do need to heal.
Southerners actually really like hearing this story.
I loved it. She and I, Caroline, were like, So thank you both.
Thank you.
This is delightful. Thanks.
Gianna.
Hi. I would tell you who I am, but you already
I know who
I
you
am.
are.
We don't know who you are.
Oh, this is Gianna Tejada, one of my favorite people in the world.
I have not read your book yet. It sounds fantastic, but how did you know you wanted to get into journalism and writing in general?
I got into journalism when I wrote an essay back in high school that got me in trouble with a principal. And I thought, this is fun. This is fun. I like getting in good trouble, as a famous man said. And I also like learning about the world. And so I learned so many different things. As you know, I wrote in China. I wrote stories. Well, you were a baby then, but I know that we were journalists in China, and so I think that you learn so much. I think sometimes when it turns back on yourself and you realize you're telling a family story, it's a different kind of thing than asking other people about themselves. So that was probably the difference for me, is the difference between doing it as a journalist where you're removed and you're just trying to do research and find out information that has nothing to do with you, and then finding stories that have everything to do with you. It's a different feeling, but in some ways a lot more compelling. So I hope you read the book too, Gianna.
Yeah, I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
That's such a good question, Gianna. And Debbie, what was the essay about that got you into trouble?
It was a satire. I was making fun of all the apathetic students who were criticizing everything. So it was in their voice, this is bad, that is bad, that is bad. And then they all went off to the store to buy candy. It was supposed to be a satirical look at the apathetic students, but my principal thought it made the school look bad, and he wanted me to write a retraction, and my teacher said, "You're not writing a retraction." And then I had these two grown-ups arguing over this, and I thought, this is fun. This is.
Do you see what a good question you had?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I assume you did not write the retraction.
No.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred. I was interested in the conversation, but your exchange was so interesting that it kind of took me away from the interest of the book and put me on the periphery of what you were talking about. And when you're talking about there was slavery up north. I wasn't so much surprised by that, but I was more surprised when I started reflecting on my Black studies. I never read any fictional book about slavery in the North. It was
Toni
all
Morrison.
Southern.
Toni Morrison wrote a fantastic book called A Mercy, which is set in New York State. That it's not as well known as some
What's
of her.
the name of it?
It's called A Mercy.
Okay.
Mercy.
And so that kind of piqued my interest while you were talking. But then when you talked about an individual you were working with, and it wasn't a kumbaya moment, I'm fascinated now by how a person who had nothing to do with the past, but they affected your life, you have a problem connecting or feel some kind of tension, okay? It's almost one of those, put yourself in your other shoes or other foot. If I met somebody who enslaved my cousins and family members in the past, how would I feel about them? So,
How would you feel about them?
I was grappling with it, and still, because I put myself in those shoes, and I would be disingenuous saying I'm not affected. Right. And so which leads to my point, which is when you say you don't feel guilty, but you feel responsible, which kind of comes in a form of a reparation. How do you go on with an individual who had nothing to do with that? Because I watch Finding Your Roots on TV, and there's always this moment of how do you feel knowing your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents had slaves, and how do you reconcile those feelings? And you talked about people who come here who don't feel responsible. Mm-hmm. So you take those two, one feels legitimate, I had nothing to do with it, on the other hand, you're trying to reconcile somebody who enslaved your forefathers. How do you deal with the one where you have to deal with the forefathers who had your in slavery, and you know that person?
I think I understand what you're asking. I mean, there's always a sense of distancing, and one of the problems in the North is that slavery ended a lot earlier than it did in the South. So people in the South can say, Well, it ended officially in 1827. So in New York, yeah. So Pennsylvania was earlier. Yeah, New Jersey was the latest state. Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that because it's harder for a northerner to say my great grandmother or my whatever, so there's a certain arm's length that you can keep people from that, and so that makes it a little bit more removed, and then it allows people to say it had nothing to do with me, it had nothing to do with my family, and they can feel sort of in a bubble away from it. So that makes it a lot harder.
Well, it kind of goes back to when Ben Affleck, I don't know if you remember that, but when he found out that his 4 parents had slaves and he ostracized himself from the public for a while.
He didn't want to talk about it. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Oh, I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, I am too. I don't understand
It's
why
almost like
he
a
would
psychological,
not.
psychiatric approach to understanding why people.
Yeah, I don't know.
hate that.
I mean, not, I've met a lot of white people who know this about their ancestors and who say, I know it. I don't know what I'm going to say or do about it, but I know it. And my quirky reaction or my reaction is not one that everyone's going to be able to do. But on the other hand, in some ways, that's even more important than for me to do the story. So there is a book out there that tells that story.
And what was the name of Toni Morrison's book again?
A Mercy,
A Mercy.
Mercy.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nandini, and I run something here called the Women's Storytelling Salon. And one of the things I found over the last many years of doing it is that the origin story is a very powerful part of one story, but you've taken origin to another level. And so I'm curious, because the origin story is a very empowering part of someone's story, how this sort of deep, probe into your origins has, I mean, I don't want to use the word dramatically, but how has it changed you? How do you think it forces you to think differently about how you live moving forward? I'm just curious.
I think it's more that it's deepened my sense of what history is. It's made me realize that, even though I knew my grandparents very well, I honestly didn't know how they lived in many ways day-to-day lives. I didn't talk to them. One of my grandfathers, my Dutch grandfather, was born in 1899, so he had to have been a young man during the Spanish flu. And I still regret not asking him, what was that like to live through the Spanish flu, especially when we went through the pandemic. So it's deepened my sense of the kinds of questions that one should ask. And it's deepened my sense of what we should all ask about our history and what we should try to understand about our history. But I think that it's more just sort of given it sort of a larger sense of what that means.
But curious, I mean, if you had your grandparents alive today or ancestors even before that, would you challenge them on what you found out? And how do you think that because, I mean, I know that when my grandparents were alive, there were lots of debates that we didn't agree on, right, in terms of intergenerational sort of differences. So I'm just curious whether you think you would be able to address that with them, or
with my grandparents.
Like
I mean, I think a grandparent-grandchild relationship is very special.
It is. Mm-hmm.
I doubt I would ever challenge my grandparents, but maybe there would be a way I could ask questions of them that I wouldn't have been able to ask. Yes. Eleanor and I talked a lot about, not to keep coming back to Mire Vandery, but we keep coming back to a fantasy of if we could have sat at the knee of Mire Vandery and just asked her, what was your childhood like? Did she speak with a Dutch accent like Sojourner Truth? What could she tell us about her life that we didn't know? Those are the kinds of stories I'd really love to hear. And also I would like to sort of sit down with my ancestors and say, what was going through your mind when you did that? How did you think of this? How could you sell off a woman with 2 little children? how does that work? I don't know if my 21st century brain would be able to kind of understand what their 18th and 19th century brains could do. But I would like to have the chance to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, it raises the whole issue of what is normalized in a particular period and how people live with that, and which is happening today, right? So it is very interesting to look at history to understand what's happening today. But thank you. I can't wait to read this. Yeah.
One of the things you discovered was not just your family ancestry, but also this friendship with Eleanor. And I'm curious, you share a sense of humor and approach to things, but it's just because you are a writer and she isn't, that she's not your co-author?
I asked her to co-author it with me because I thought it would have enriched the book. But she's not a writer. She said absolutely not. I talked her into doing the afterword to the book, so she did do that, and it was great. So I think that she was a co-researcher for many, many of the chapters. Not all of the chapters, but many, many of the chapters. She was the one who discovered that Caesar Egberts, Mary's father, had purchased his freedom just exactly at the moment that she stopped having babies. And we think that wasn't a coincidence. She was the one who discovered the story about Mary's son Thomas, who was a boatman on the Hudson River, who was arrested in the 1850s because they thought he had stolen the boat, but he was just driving the boat. But because he was a black man, he was piloting the boat. He was a black man, so he was arrested for piloting while black, as Bob said. So I give him credit for that line. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that so she found stories. I found a number of stories that were just absolutely fascinating to find and to kind of put together. So I'm lucky that I had her level of participation that she was able to do. But it does raise the question of whether I'm appropriating the story of a black family. And I think that is a legitimate question to ask. I think that I would have loved to have her voice more in the book, but I also had to be respectful of what she was willing to do. And I think that this is also my family story that I'm telling, so I'm trying to tell that as well. So I think I hit a good balance between those, but I think it is a legitimate question to ask.
Debbie, I'm so proud of you. I think this is an amazing achievement.
Thank you.
I think the emotional toll, the emotional ringer that you put yourself through to be able to dig into this and to come up with this is jaw-dropping. And I'm proud to know you.
Thank you so much, Helene, and thank you for
Debbie
being a
Bruno.
model.